The government has revealed a record defence spend in this week's budget of more than $52 billion. $4.2 billion of that will be spent in the next decade to support the initial stages of the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. Joining us live now is Peter Dean, Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Studies Centre. Good to see you, Peter. Thanks for your time. The overall annual defence spend pushes that $50 billion mark for the first time in 2023-24. The government sticking to that commitment of roughly 2% of GDP over the forward estimates. What is at the crux of the argument as to why such a big spend is necessary in the face of, as we know, so many other challenges and other competing demands on the budget front?
Absolutely. Well, as the Defence Strategic Review, which was handed down on the 14th of February, and just before Anzac Day, we got a public version of that pointed out, Australia in the international environment is living through a strategic period that hasn't been seen since the end of the Second World War. We're all conscious, of course, of the war in Ukraine, the extended military build-up that China is doing that's not transparent throughout the region, and the increasing uncertainty within that region. And going back to 2020, the previous government ended 10 years of warning time for major conflict in the region, and that was reinforced in the DSR. So what we're seeing here is the need, as we move to national defence and a whole-of-nation effort, and we saw Penny Wong speaking about this in the press club as well. This is about Australia's contribution to the region and to its own defence to ensure a favourable balance of power so we can pursue Australian interests. And as you said, this means that we're topping $50 billion for the first time. Now, many commentators have actually said that the government should be actually spending more on this, and it'll be interesting to see how the opposition reply to the defence spending tonight and over the next few days. But $50 billion for the first time is an interesting mark, but we also know that's moving from about 2.04% of GDP to about 2.3% of GDP in the next decade. But of course, inflation is high, and so that's kind of eroding a lot of the spending power of the Defence Department, although this does give a real increase.
It is also interesting, I guess, to look at the spend that goes along with the initial AUKUS deal. There was a boost of spending on agencies that will support that AUKUS agreement, as well as university support spots in recognition that we really need to upskill Australians, don't we, in order to be ready to work on that subs program. There seems to be a lot that needs to happen that we need to spend on in the meantime to prepare us to actually have those submarines.
Oh, absolutely. And as the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister have said, this is our whole-of-nation building effort. This is bigger than the Snowy Mountains scheme. And what we're really seeing with the $4.5 billion over 10 years, so about $480 million per year ongoing, is the initial steps to set up Australia's acquisition of these submarines. So that's the establishment of the Australian Submarine Agency, the establishment of an independent monitor and advisor to provide independent health checks and proactive advice to the program, regulatory standards, and work to include non-proliferation safeguards. And if you actually look over in the DFAT budget, there's actually quite a considerable amount of money for DFAT to support this endeavours as well. And as you said, most significantly will be the upskilling. And I think what we saw in the budget this time was $127.3 million over 4 years to the university sector. That gives us 4,000 Commonwealth-supported places of higher education institutions to support the skilling requirements for AUKUS Pillar 1 and nuclear-powered submarines. I think this will only be the start because, as the DSR has pointed out, and as the government before then had pointed out, defence is having a bit of a workforce crisis at the moment. And so upskilling the workforce, getting people into defence is really important. It's not just the uniform elements of defence. Where we really have to upskill you is actually in the defence industry area. And there's going to be significant jobs for Australians going forward in the future. And I think this 4,000 Commonwealth-supported places is just the tip of the iceberg of what we'll have to see in all that in the next sort of 10 and 20 years.
Peter, now that the budget is done and dusted after this week, the next really huge item on Anthony Albanese's calendar is, of course, the Quad Summit coming up in less than a fortnight. For that, just a reminder to our viewers, we're going to see the US President, Indian, Japanese leaders in Sydney. It's the first time Australia's hosted the summit. What should we expect?
Well, I think the first thing we're going to have to look out for is the US President going to make it? So if you look at US domestic politics, there is the threat of a budget shutdown. The President has announced that he will be stopping in Papua New Guinea on the way to announce a defence pact with Papua New Guinea, which is really great for Australian security as well. But if he does make it down and the summit does go ahead, which I expect it will, but there is a bit of a risk there. I think what we're going to see is some more forward-leaning agenda from all three countries about buttressing the key areas that they're looking at. Things like maritime security, health security, and these sort of broader foreign policy elements of supporting the region. And it'll be interesting to see if there's any discussion around the US-led IPEF digital trade agreement. It'll be interesting to also see how much further they can push, for instance, maritime security cooperation, which has been a little bit more at the hard edge of the Quad engagement in that piece. But it's a real coup for Australia to be able to host this in Sydney. It's going to get those four major world leaders. And in particular, if you look at Japan, for instance, Japan had a recent national security strategy, national defence strategy, which is very, very forward-leaning, doubling their defence budget and moving along very similar lines to what the Defence Strategic Review recommended for our government to do as well.
Peter Dean, always appreciate you making the time. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.